Hello. This video goes together with a post that I'm doing at DP Review called Reconsidering JPEG. In this video I'm going to illustrate the post-processing that I did on the images that I was writing about and showing in that post. I'm going to be using DxO Optics Pro 10, which I'm going to call DxO for short, and Adobe Lightroom 6. I'm going to start here very briefly with Faststone Image Viewer. I've got here some photos, and I've got two of each because I've got one JPEG and one RAW for them. I've not got a huge number, only 20. This same technique will work on 200, 2000 images. It's the same amount of work involved. The computer will have to do more work with more images, but if it's going to take a long time, you just have to do something else. And incidentally, you can carry on using, or I can carry on using this PC while DxO is doing its work, and it's DxO that will take the time if it's going to be a long time. It's very well behaved as far as I can tell, and it lets me surf or use Lightroom or do anything else on the computer. This PC has a quad processor, and DxO will use all of them if it can to speed things up, but it backs off if you want to do something, and so I'm quite pleased with the way it behaves. So I've got a mixture here of RAW and JPEG files. Now normally I suspect people will be using either RAW or JPEG. I'll use both because we want to have a look at what happens with both sorts. It's very slightly different. So the first thing I'm going to do is to simplify things and separate out the JPEGs from the RAWs. So I'm going to make a couple of new folders, one called RAW, and there's some action going on here that you can't see because of where it's decided to put these windows, and one called JPEG. So I'm going to take the JPEGs and put them in here. Now notice that there are different RAW files. There's a CR2 there, that's from a Canon 70D. There are RW2s, some of which are from an FZ200. This one's from a Panasonic G5. For this process, it doesn't matter how many different cameras are jumbled in there, how many ISOs you've used, what the scenes look like. It's the same processing for all of them. And that's what I've been talking about in the thread. I mean, you may do other processing as well, but again, I've talked about that in the thread. So I'm going to put these into the RAW folder. So we now need to process these. So I'm going to go across to DxO. And here we are, we've got this demo photos JPEG folder, and that's where we've got 10 JPEGs. If I select the first of them and then Control A, it selects all of them, and that might be 500 that I've just selected, it doesn't matter. And I now have to tell DxO what I want it to do with them, and I do that by applying a preset. And I get a choice of ones to use, and I'm going to use this one called GA JPG01B. So that's it. I've told DxO what I want it to do, and I can now tell it to do it. So I say export to disk. I have to tell it what format I want the files to be in. They might be JPEGs, they might be DNGs. I want them as TIFFs. I want it to put them where the where the original files are, and I want to call it, it's going to put something on the end of the file name to distinguish it from the original, and I want it to say underscore DXO, so that I know that DXO has been working on it, JPG, and then that 01B, so I know what's been used. So I tell it to export it, and DXO is now doing the exports. If we look at the bottom here, this is telling us what's going on, and at the moment it's done 1. If I move this up a bit, there we go, it's done 2 in 13 seconds, 3 in 16, 4 in 20. It's about 5 seconds for each, and that's the speed at which it runs through JPEGs. It can run through RAWs in about the same time, but RAWs can take a lot longer, and we'll talk about why that would be in just a minute. So we've now finished the DXO processing of those 10 JPEGs, and if we go back now and have a look at Faststone and have a look in that folder, we've now got 20 files in there, because 10 of them are TIFF files, and these contain the processed photos. During all this process, the original photos are not going to be touched by anything. DXO isn't going to touch them or alter them and move them or do anything to them. Neither is Lightroom. So having done that on the JPEGs, let's deal with the RAW files. So I want DXO back, and I choose the RAW directory. I select them all. I say I want to apply a preset. Now I've got 2 presets I can use here. This one doesn't use the RAW only, called Prime noise reduction, and this one does. So if I use this one, it'll take, I think, about the same time for each image. If I use the Prime processing, well, it depends upon the size of the file, but it may take between 40 seconds and a minute or so on this PC for each image, which means that if you're doing hundreds of images, your PC is going to be perhaps working overnight to do it. So I'm excuse me, I'm going to choose the quicker one of these 2, and I've now told DXO what I want it to do. So I say export to disk, and the only thing I've got to change here is that I'm going to change that where it says JPG to RAW. This is really for my own purposes, so that I'm keeping track of exactly what processing is applied to each of the images. You don't really need to do that for general purpose use. So I tell it to export, and now DXO is going through, and let's just see how long it takes for these. It's gone 10 seconds, it hasn't done any yet, so it's slower. 15, there we go, 16, 17, 18, 19, oh, it's a lot slower. There we go, it's going at 1 every 11 seconds or so, so it's taking twice as long for the JPEGs. Well, I've learned something there. So the next thing is to complete the processing in Lightroom, and while that's going on, I'll put Lightroom up, and we now have to tell Lightroom where these things are. In DXO and in Faststone, over on this left hand side, you get a list of the directories in the file system, and by and large both of them keep that up to date. Lightroom doesn't work like that. You have to tell it when you want it to deal with something. So I want it now to deal with those TIFF files that are in the JPEG folder. So I have to tell it to do what it calls importing. Now this is a bit misleading. It isn't actually going to move anything anywhere. It's just going to take note of where those are. So I'll say import, and I now have to choose a source, and it's demo photos, and for the moment I'll import the JPEG from the JPEG directory, and it's found, it says here 20 photos. That's right, there are 10 JPEGs and 10 TIFFs, so I'll tell it to import, and all Lightroom is doing now is adding to its encyclopedia, its directory, that it knows that there are these 20 images in this particular place. Now what I want to do is to apply some Lightroom settings to the TIFF files. So I'm going to choose the TIFF files by telling Lightroom to look at the TIFF file type, and it says there that you can see there are 10 of them. So now if I select all of them, and again there could be 500 that I'm dealing with here, it would be just as quick. Over here we can see saved presets, and I go down to user presets, and here we are, JPEG post DxO adjustment 01. Well, they're JPEGs, that's what I want to do. So I apply the adjustments, and all of those have now been adjusted. And if we have a look here under develop, we can see what Lightroom has done to these. Go up to the top, it's turned the exposure down a bit. It's turned the highlights and shadows down, and it's turned the whites, which is the very brightest area, up. By the way, this is an image that I've talked about in the post, which doesn't respond at all well to being processed. The raw version of it is fine, but the JPEG one is pretty horrible. It's got what's called posterization. And what other changes? Oh, it's no, that's it. There's no noise reduction and there's no sharpening. So it's just those things at the top that have been done to it. Now, if I go back to the library, DxO has finished dealing with the raw files, so I can import the raw files, and it's found 20 photos, which is correct. So if I import those, I can now tell it that, because there are 2 of each, I can now tell it that I want to deal with the file type TIFF. There are now 10. I select all of those, and I tell Lightroom that I want to put a preset on them for the raw post DxO stuff. And if we have a look at what Lightroom has done to these, it's slightly different. It's done the same thing to the exposure and the highlights, the shadows and the whites. But down here we can see it's sharpened them, but it hasn't applied any noise reduction because DxO has been looking after the noise reduction. Let's go back to Faststone. There. We can see the TIFFs there. We'll be able to see the TIFFs there in the raw directory. There was an issue then of what has DxO actually done to these files? What's in these TIFF files? What has DxO done to these raw files in order to produce these TIFF files, similarly with the JPEGs? Well, let's go and have a look at DxO. And it's got two modes, it's organize and customize. If we look at the JPEGs, for example, and we look at customize, we can see what settings that preset set up for these files. It applied a little bit of exposure compensation in the opposite direction from what Lightroom's done. Look, these were developed as a as a trial and error process, and it's ended up probably with some silliness in it. One of these takes the exposure down a little bit and the other one puts it up a little bit. I have no idea whether it makes a difference if I just equalize them out, whether it would work the same way. Granted the fact that I've got some settings that seem to work, there's no way I'm going to change them at this stage. Smart lighting is, again, I don't know what some of these things do. I have no idea exactly what they do. I have a rough idea. It helps sort the lighting out. It sort of, I don't know, brings highlights down and shadows up and so on. The amount of whatever it is it's doing that it does depends upon where this intensity is set, and as a bit of trial and error, that's about halfway through what it calls mild, and it calls, I don't know, medium possibly. Selective tone, all it's doing there is raising the shadows a little bit. And clear view is removing haziness from pictures, and it's again applying a relatively mild amount of that. Under contrast, it's not doing anything to what we normally think of as contrast, but it's altering the micro contrast, which helps with showing up fine detail. The noise reduction, it's applying noise reduction, and there are two sorts. It's using this HQ, which is faster. It can't use prime. I can click on that for all I like. It won't do it because it will only do it for raw files. And it's if you use this prime noise reduction that it really takes a long time to do the processing. DxO lens softness. DxO get new kit, and they measure it in various ways, see how it performs, and then they apply some process or other which helps sharpen up what you get out of your lenses. It's really rather clever. It does mean that you can't use DxO on new equipment for a few months until they've sorted out their the settings that they need to use inside the software to do this sharpening. And this setting is also dealing with some chromatic aberration. You'll notice there's a distortion setting at the bottom here. That is turned off. If we look at the raw files and have a look at that same place, then distortion is on. That's because JPEGs have some modifications cooked into them, and one of them is geometric distortion is corrected before a JPEG is written. It's done by the camera, so your own processing shouldn't do it again, whereas with raw files they're not corrected for geometry, and so you do have to apply distortion. There are also differences in the Lightroom processing. I think I probably mentioned that the RAWs are sharpened, whereas the JPEGs aren't sharpened because they've already been sharpened in the camera. Now obviously with all these settings you can adjust them to your liking. If you look at the posts at DP Review, you may think, yeah, well, it's all very well, but I don't like the look he's got on those photos. They're way too over the top, or they're too soft, or whatever. This is, you can choose whatever settings you like. You can do this sort of thing with other bits of software as well. There's nothing special that you got to use these particular bits of software. I'm just trying to illustrate with this post that a DP Review that there is actually scope for making sometimes quite considerable differences to the look of images if you process them a bit, whether they're JPEGs or RAW. So that's it. That's the process for altering, doing the processing on JPEG and RAW images. Now, I've been talking about this, talking a lot, while we've been going through this, and it may make it seem as if it's a longer process than is actually the case. So what I'm going to do is to go back to Faststone and go through the process. You know what's happening now. and let's just see how long it takes to do. So I've got another set of photos here, and so what I did was to create a couple of folders. And again, if you're only using RAW or JPEG, you wouldn't need to do this step. So I've got two folders. I take the JPEGs, I put them in there, and I put the RAWs into the other one. I then go over to DxO. I'm having to do a bit of fiddling in the background to get what Windows recording that should be recorded. So I go over to DxO and I find demo photos 2. There they are. So I want to process the JPEGs. I select them all and apply a preset, and that's the preset I want. I tell it to export to disk. I tell it, and again this isn't necessary for most people, I tell it I want just as a JPG, and I tell it to export. While that's going on, I can go to the RAWs, pick them all and apply a preset, and in this time I'll use the RAW preset with the quick noise reduction. Tell it to export to disk. Again, this is unnecessary, this bit. I'll change that to RAW just out of habit because I'm that sort of person, and that's off doing its processing, and in not very long we'll get some images through to Lightroom. Let's just see how it's doing. So it's going through the first lot quite quickly, it's almost finished, and the second lot are waiting until the first lot have finished. Now it started on the second lot. So we can go over to Lightroom now. We might have gone away and had a cup of tea or slept overnight, depending on how many of these things is being done and what noise reduction we're using for them. So let's go over to Lightroom, and here we go. And we need to import those JPEG ones. So this was, we need to import demo photos 2. We'll just do the JPEGs for the moment. It's found 20 photos, which is correct. It's imported them now. I'll tell it just to pick the TIFFs, file type TIFF, and I'll select them all and apply a preset to them, and that is the RAW ones, the JPEG ones. So basically that's the process, and we do the same thing for the RAW. It really doesn't take much user intervention to do that. You can process afterwards, obviously, if you want to fine-tune them. So there we are. That's the process that I was writing about in all those long posts at DP Review, and that's what it looks like in action. So that's all for now. Goodbye.